Good afternoon, dear professor. I am Gustavo Serrano. My partner is Ariel Molina. We're here to talk about quantitative methods. First of all, the book talks us about what is an experimental design. The basic intent of an experimental design is to test the impact of a treatment or an intervention on an outcome, controlling all other factors that might influence that outcome. For example, we could test the impact of the amount of water that will be the treatment between two plants. When one group receives a treatment and the other group does not, the experimenter can isolate whether it is the treatment and no other factors that influence that outcome. That will be, for example, the fertilizer or the sunlight. In the case of applying this methodology in a quantitative design, such as a survey, the following must be taken into account. So, defining survey and components. Survey design provides a quantitative or numerical description of trends, attitudes, or opinions of a population by studying a sample of that population. From these results, the researcher generalizes or make claims about the population. Components of a survey. Identify the purpose of the survey research. This purpose is to generalize from a sample to a population so that inferences can be made about some characteristic, attitude, or behavior of this population. Indicate why a survey is preferred type of data collection procedure for the study. Consider the advantages of survey designs, for example, identifying attributes of a large population from a small group of individuals. Indicate whether the survey will be cross-sectional with the data collection at one point in time, or whether it will be longitudinal with data collected over time. Specify the form of data collection. This will be self-administrated questionnaires, interviews, structured record reviews, or structured observations. As help, the book specifies a checklist of questions for designing a survey method. We can see here some questions. Is the purpose of a survey design stated? Are the reasons for choosing design mentioned? And some others. So, what about the population and sample? Here are essential aspects of the population and sample to describe in a research plan. First of all, identify the population and size of the study. Identify if the sample is single-stage or multi-stage. A single-stage sample procedure is one which the researcher has access to names in the population and can sample the people directly. In cluster, the researcher first identifies clusters. These are groups or organizations, obtain names of the individuals within those clusters, and then samples within them. Identify the selection process for individuals. It is recommended to select a random sample because with randomization, a representative sample provides the ability to generalize to a population. Less desirable is a non-probability sample or convenience sample, in which respondents are chosen based on their convenience and availability. Identify a stratification of the population. Stratification means that a sample reflects the true proportion in the population of individuals with certain characteristics. Discuss the procedures for selecting the sample from available lists. The most rigorous method for selecting the sample is to choose individuals using random numbers table. Indicate the number of people in the sample. This is easy. You just have to use the sample size formula, which it is here above. So now my partner will talk to you about instrumentation.
If we are doing a survey design or experimental design, it's important to talk about the instrumentation. To start with this section, we can introduce the instrumentation of the surveys, talking about the purpose and why the survey is the best option to this research. We have three kinds of surveys. The first one is the original, when we use an existing instrument from previous research. We have the modified surveys, when we take a previous existing survey, but we apply modification. And finally, a sample survey, when we took different parts of different surveys to create a new one. Also, we can use online tools like SurveyMonkey, where we can apply online service by email. When we use existing instrument, it's necessary to review and check the validity and reliability of this instrument. We can use the results and the scores from previous instrument to review these two characteristics. Also, we have 4 forms of validity. The first one is content, the second one is predictive and construct, and finally, recent perspective. When we apply modification on an existing survey, we have, and it's very necessary to establishing the validity and reliability to be to have an instrument be able to use in the new research. Also, to give a perspective to the reader, we have to you have to show an example of how it's going to be the instrument. Example item showed case in proposal appendix, and finally instrument section, cover letters, demographics, attitudes, behaviors, and scale used. Also, it's important when we apply the modified service or maybe a sample service, do test to this new service. When we do this test, we establishing content validity, improve questions, format, and scales. And we have to do a plan to test the new service. For this, we have to have a specific number of testers and incorporate a part of feedback to improve our survey. And finally, if we want to do an online survey using, for example, SurveyMonkey, we have to apply that plan for ensuring a high response rate. Salant and Dylan state the 4-phase process. Okay, about the variables in a study. We can link in variables question and service item to give a better perspective to the reader about how the variables and how the question in the service are or have relation. We can use a table like the 8.2. In the first column, we have every single variable in each row. In the second column, we have a specific research question that is associated to the variable in the same row. And finally, we have in the third column the specific question in the survey. We talk about the variable in the same row.
Now I'm going to talk to you about components of an experimental method plan. First of all, participant. Describe the selection process for participants as either random or not random. In many experiments, only a convenient sample is possible because the investigator must use naturally formed groups such as a classroom, a family unit, an organization, or volunteers. This is called a quasi-experiment because individuals are not randomly assigned. Assigning randomly individuals to groups. In the case of this happens, the procedure is called a true experiment. Here, it should be discussed how the procedure eliminates the possibility of systematic differences that could affect the outcomes. Third, identify other features that might influence the outcome based on ability levels or demographic variables. Tell the reader about the size of the group and the procedures for determining the size of each group. This calculation involves 3 stages. First, level of statistical significance for the experiment, or alpha value. The amount of power desired in a study typically presents as high, medium, or low. The effect size, the expected differences in the means between the control and the experimental groups expressed in standard deviation units. Researchers already have set and recommended values for these 3 factors: alpha 0.05, power 0.80, and effect size 0.50. Now, variables. First of all, identify the independent variable and the dependent variable or variables in the experiment. Instrumentation and materials. Describe the instruments that participants must use in the experiment. Indicate the validity, reliability, the individuals who develop them, and any permissions needed to use them. Discuss the materials used for the experimental treatment. This plan might include special writing instructions to ensure that materials can be administered without variability to the experimental group. And lastly, experimental procedures. Indicating the overall experimental type, citing reasons for the design, advancing a visual model to help the reader understand the procedures, identify the type of experimental design to be used in the proposed study. Here we have 4 types of experimental designs. The first one, pre-experimental design. The researcher studies a single group and provides an intervention during the experiment. Second, true experiments. In a true experiment, as I told you before, the investigator randomly assigns the participants to treatment groups. In quasi-experiments, the investigator uses control and experimental groups in order to obtain the information, but does not randomly assign participants to groups. And lastly, single subject designs. This design involves observing the behavior of a single individual or a small number of individuals over time. Identify what is being compared in the experiment. For example, a factorial design may be used when 2 or more treatment variables have to be examined and have simultaneous effects and independent treatment variables on an outcome. And finally, provide a diagram or a figure to illustrate the specific research design to be used. In the same way, the book specifies a checklist of questions for designing experimental procedures, like the ones we can see here.
Okay, now we are going to review the problem that we can have with the validity in quantitative research. What is a validity threats? It's any factor which can be internal or external that can affect the outcomes of the results of a research. It needs to be identified and to find a plan to minimize this effect on the outcome. We have 2 kind of threats. The first one is the internal, related to experimental procedures and participant experiences. For example, we can mention the history, the maturation, the regression, the selection, and the mortality of the people who is the participant in the experiment. And the second one is the external threats. It is caused by the generalization of the result in unstudied racial and social groups, in researcher settings, or past and future situations. For address this problem of validity threats, we have to identify potential threats, define how many these threats going to affect to the research results, and finally looking for alternatives or strategies to eliminate or minimize the effect of these threats. Also, we can look in the references, the specific references which talk about this specific problem. About the procedure of quantitative research. A proposal writer needs to detail how the experiment will be conducted, allowing reader to understand the design, observation, treatment, and the other activities. We have 6 basic steps to follow in this section. The first one is measurement of the dependent variable. After that, we match the participant by their score. It means that if 2 people have high score in the first measurement, they're going to be matched, and people with low score also they're going to be matched. After that, we take one person of the pair and we assign to an experimental group and the other one to a control group. After that, we apply experimental treatment only to the experimental group. Then we measure the dependent variable in both groups. And finally, with this result, we perform a statistical test to get conclusion about the hypothesis. The data analysis. it's important to explain to the reader what type of statistical analysis they're going to be used in the experiment or in the research. We have to report the descriptive statistic, we have to indicate the inferential statistic that is going to be used, and finally, if we have single subject research, we can compare in graph the variables. And finally, interpreting results. For the interpretation of results, it is important to address the following points. The first one is to assess if support or refutation the hypothesis with the result of the statistical test. We have to realize if there are going to be participant impacts. Also, we have to analyze significant based on literature and study theory, and evaluate potential procedural shortcoming affect internal validity. And finally, discuss if the result can be generalized to other social and racial situations with the same information that was looking for in the research.